Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Jose Rivera, the CEO of CSIA. Thank you for attending this month's webinar. In today's webinar, Jeff Miller will walk participants through the key areas of Section 6 of the Best Practices and Benchmarks from CSIA, Processes of the System Development Lifecycle. This particular section deserves early and focused attention when working to implement best practices into your systems. Invest time developing effective and efficient internal systems now, and you'll see high returns on investment and increased value later. Jeff will walk through key elements that he finds add the most value when preparing for the CSIA certification audit. This webinar is part of our efforts at CSIA to promote and provide training around our best practices. For 2016, we plan to continue to broadcast monthly webinars on best practices. These webinars will be delivered by members whose companies have received our certification on multiple rounds, as is the case with interstate control systems. We would like to highlight the 4-fee extensive project management remote learning training that is being offered for a September 20th start. The cost is $1,500 for CSIA members. This training is delivered remotely in a joint effort with ISA, so attendees don't have to travel for this. The course is designed to prepare attendees, beginner to mid-level experienced project managers and engineers, to deliver on the daily project management responsibilities. For today's webinar, be sure to ask questions in the Q&A box, not the chat box. Questions will be answered during the webinar, so be sure to ask them. The webinar will be archived for later viewing, and the slides will also be available. The host and sponsor of our monthly business topic webinars is Software Toolbox, a CSIA partner member. Software Toolbox understands that you're not just buying software licenses, but are investing in a supplier relationship. Software Toolbox has supported CSIA since 1997 and seen the best practices grow into the great tool they are today. In Software Toolbox best practice recommendations, it's the advice to think carefully before writing custom code and only do so when no other solution is available. Custom one-off applications are filled with risk and hidden costs when evaluated over the full lifetime cycle. Software Toolbox highly configurable off-the-shelf software products and support services are proven to lower system integration risk. In keeping with the ongoing continuous improvement theme of these webinars, it reminds CSIA business owners about the free white paper that discusses 10 trends for industrial decision support. This software application space that has traditionally been filled with custom applications or solutions built on spreadsheet spaghetti. Learn how smart system integrators are moving away from custom and leveraging the latest technology to help their clients. Practice some continuous improvement and read this paper to help you provide new insights to your clients. Download the free paper at softwaretoolbox.com/CSIA August 2016. I would like to introduce today's webinar presenter, Jeff Miller, Director of Project Management at Interstate Control Systems. Interstate has received the CSIA certification 5 consecutive times and is an active member of CSIA. Jeff is a member of the CSIA board and our current treasurer and vice chair. So without further delay, here's Jeff Miller.
Thank you, Jose. I appreciate the introduction and look forward to the presentation today. Just a couple of housekeeping items for you guys. I will be watching the chat box as we're going, or the Q&A box. And if you've got questions on anything while we're moving along, I would encourage you to do that. Put those up on the Q&A box at any time, and I'll try to answer those questions as they come in. We'll also have a time of Q&A at the end of this, and we will open up the mics on your phone connections if you would like to ask a question verbally, or you can type in the chat box. And I'll remind you of that again as we go. The section today that we're going to be talking about is Section 6, which is System Development Lifecycle. And just just a couple of things that are just related to this Best Practices webinar series again. A few things that Jose may have mentioned, but I want to emphasize. The real goal of the series is to expose any of the participants in this to the key areas that are covered by best practices and benchmarks. What are some areas that you should focus on that really provide the most strategic benefit to your company if you were to go and apply those sections right away? We're going to talk about, insights on if you're doing audit preparation, here's some focus areas that you might need to look at. And then, in particular, I like to cover the lessons learned of what we found as we've implemented, and our company has been certified 5 times now with CSIA, and we've learned new things every time we've gone through the certification process, and in particular, some big lessons learned along the way on how to actually implement best practices into our systems. And we'll talk about that in particular associated with System Development Lifecycle today. So we'll look at, this is kind of the agenda, what I plan to cover. We're going to look at, what is System Development Lifecycle, how should I approach this section to get the most bang for the buck, and what are key areas that the auditor will be looking for, and then what are the lessons learned. And I think the couple of things out of here that if you could really just plan to take away, what are the things that really provide the most bang for the buck, and these lessons learned on implementing those. If you can take those away with you today, you could start implementing this section and really start to see the business value hit your bottom line. And 100% from ICSI Interstate Controls perspective, implementing of best practices has made a huge impact in our bottom line. And I've heard lots of integrators talk about, they really want their customers to be asking for it. I will tell you that has very little impact into my decision to implement best practices in our first audit or even in our 5th audit, because it's really about improving our business. And by improving your business, you're going to be around a lot longer. You're going to put more dollars in your pocket because you're going to lose less dollars to things that you wished you had have done differently. So we're going to talk a little bit about what is System Development Lifecycle, and I threw up 3 definitions. Wikipedia says it's a process for planning, creating, testing, and deploying an information system. Kind of, goes along the lines of the IS side. The NIST definition, National Institute of Standards and Technology, it's an overall process for developing, implementing, retiring information systems. So it includes initiation, analysis, design, implementation, and maintenance to disposal. One of the things that from a CSIA perspective, we don't talk much about the retiring side of it. That tends to be more what our customers are thinking about from the entire life cycle of the project. But it is important for the CSIA integrator to think about what's the likelihood that this project will go on or that this product will go on forever. It's not. It'll have to be replaced at some point. So helping them make good choices now so that they can be planning for even the retirement of the system. And then the best practices definition, it's activities directly involved in producing client deliverables within the context of the project. So it's got to define scope, deliverables, and a known ending point. So if you think about the definition of a project has a very definite beginning and it has a very definite end. So we're thinking of System Development Lifecycle from the project mentality. We have all the way from the beginning stages of developing the system to we've got the system started and running now. So that's the scope of what we cover in best practices, is that piece of it. So if you think about what's the real story or associated with system development lifecycle, it's really about, it's the section, it's the part of the project where you build the deliverables of the project, and then you verify that they meet the requirements of the client. So you'll have these kind of three areas. You're going to have a start point, you're going to have a finish line, and you're going to have key tie points during the execution of the system development lifecycle that tie requirements to deliverables. And that's a key area because oftentimes, I know early on when Interstates was working on this, we didn't do very well with tying the requirements to the deliverables. So when it came to the testing phase, we oftentimes struggled with proving to the client that it met their needs. And so oftentimes there was a lot of scope creep when we'd get to the testing phase because we hadn't really defined early what the requirements were and got those signed off on by the client. And then when we got to the testing phase, we hadn't really talked about the test plan and how we were going to test it early enough in the project, so they didn't necessarily agree with how we were going to test. And so this is going to tie all that together in a kind of in a nice little bow as to if you can put this all in a package together and think about it from start to finish, you're going to get to the finish line quicker and with less scope creep. So if you've looked at the CSIA Best Practices manual and in a couple of different locations, you'll see this V diagram. But this V diagram kind of indicates the system development life cycle that at the time when we created best practices, you know, it's kind of a modified waterfall methodology, but really kind of covers everything from kickoff meetings to the final site acceptance and where they all tie together. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But if you look at just the areas that are included, if you just browse the best practices section 6, these are the main headings: internal kickoff, requirements gathering, design, development, unit module testing and integration testing, factory acceptance testing, shipping the system, installation of the system, commissioning, and then site acceptance testing. Now, many of you may use different terms for some of those testings in particular. Factory acceptance test is one that many use. Oftentimes we just call it startup when we think of site acceptance testing, but if you think about it in terms of how is the customer going to accept it, what are the things that are going to tie to that, these terms are very common. And if you go back to some of the, like even NIST, and you look at their standards associated with it, you would see that they'll use the same terminology. And a lot of the software development industries use a lot of this same terminology. So how should you approach section 6? This is kind of and I would say this isn't specific to section 6, but this is very much the way I approach every section in best practices. Spend time just reading the entire section and taking note of kind of core concepts, highlighting areas that you know you're going to want to include in systems that you're going to develop associated with deliverance of that. You know, and in particular, in this section, you're going to really focus on things like kickoff, requirements validation, design reviews, how to build the deliverables, the system development, and then acceptance testing. Those are kind of key areas. Then you go back through each section associated with it and take notes of items that are marked for audits. And you'll notice it's got this little hourglass-looking thing next to any of the audited items. Now, one of the things that I'll warn you about, though, is you can't just look at the audited items. And an example I give here is Section 6.6.3 is an audited item. It says formal verification of test. Well, 6.6.1 is not an audited item, but it's the development of the test plan. So if you don't build a test plan, you're going to have a tough time passing the section of the audit on verification of the test. So you'll see that in several locations in all of the sections, any section in best practice. What we do is we pick the sections to audit on that are going to be most representative that you've done a good job of implementing that section. So that's why it's very important to read the entire best practices section and take note of all the things you need to do, and then put your focus on those things that are going to get audited, but assume that you're going to have to do some of the other sections to get there. Section 6 is a must-pass section inside the best practices, so that there are really just 4 sections that are must-pass, and then the overall score of the audit is something else that gets looked on, and depending on if you're a level 1, 2, or 3 system integrator, which really boils down to how much revenue your company generates from the systems integration services, they're gonna focus on those scores associated with these sections and an overall score. So in your audit report or in the prep, kind of the prep documents, which I have a link listed in here, you'll see that there are scores that you'll need to meet depending on what sections that you're in. And you'll get, once you've registered to be audited, doesn't mean you have to be audited within a certain amount of time, but once you've said, I want to be audited, and you pick an auditor, you'll get some documents emailed to you that will, and in particular, the audit report, what they're going to be using to score you. That will be something that's important. But this link will have, this particular link gets you to a template that was produced, and it's actually out on our connected community for you to use to track things that are going to be your proof that you've done well in this area. So one of the things I'll show you here, and this is pretty small, but this is just a little cut out of that document. But basically, it covers every audited section of the best practices, and it'll tell you what the question is that the auditor is trying to get proof on. What I like to do with this is I take, and make sure that we assign someone to that section. One of my downfalls on the first audit that I did, and probably even the second audit that I did, was I took on most of that work for myself, and I built a lot of systems, but I didn't get a lot of buy-in into the systems because they weren't part of the development process. So it's important that you get people from your project management team, from your engineering team, involved in building the deliverables that you're going to use to, and the systems that you're going to use to prove that you've implemented this section. But so I have a section in here, or this template. It's got a section for who's responsible for that. They'll log in what they think the supporting evidence is for that I am going to pass this section, and then where it's located, and then is it completed, ready for audit, and when was it completed. And then I like to use that as, especially like when I'm doing a preliminary audit on my own systems, I'll use that as and we call that a pre-audit, but where I might go in and audit us based on what I think the auditor is looking for as an outsider, looking at what systems and processes and tools were put in place and I do that for my team, and then I'll log whatever action I think still needs to be done for that. So that's what this last section is, whatever is left that can be done before this is completed. And then I use that to track, are we ready for our audit? So it's a real handy tool for doing that. That is that link that I showed you on this slide, and this slide deck will get posted out on Connected Community. You'll be able to pull that form up from there. Now, the other thing that I like to make sure that I do in the document here, it says, where's my document location? Well, I like to prep for the audit in such a way that everything I'm going to use for my audit, that I'm going to use for proof that I've passed that section, I'm actually going to grab a copy of it. I'm going to take put a hyperlink to a standard operating procedure or whatever I want to show. I'm going to put it in a set of folders in my CSIA audit folder, and I'm going to line those out so that when I'm ready to look at section 1 and the auditor's going to go through that with me, we open that folder, or I open the folder, and I've got my overhead projector up, and we basically go through what I think is the proof documents. Now, sometimes they're not exactly what the auditor was looking for, and they're going to ask for more proof, or they may want to go talk to someone that's involved in that besides you. That's another thing that once you're going through the audit, and one of the sessions that I would like to see us do on this is really kind of what's the audit like, and how do you, what do you do as your last minute preparation, and how do you go through the audit with the auditor? And that'll be something we'll do at a later date. But this is important for me. It just makes things easy. One thing I'll tell you is it's a day to day and a half process. In fact, I've never gotten through, other than my first year that we audited, we made it in a day, but that was because we had a lot of systems that were still lacking, and we had a lot of work to do yet. Now it's always a day and a half process, and so the more organized you are during the audit, the better it's going to be for you. Okay, so I just like to look at where the areas are that are of most value here. I do have a question here I'm going to take a quick look at. The question is interesting. So can you collect, kind of pre-collect, if you look at my sections here, things that the auditor is going to want to look at, and sometimes they may have to browse your folder structures. What my experience has been is, yes, some of what I'll do inside this section 1 documents will be copies of actual marketing material, or the screen capture of our accounting screen that I wanted to show off. They may say, hey, I'd like to see that in action as well. So they may ask for additional detail. Lots of times we give them exactly what they need to see there, and they don't want to dig any deeper. I think the first time you get audited, you're going to get asked to see a few of them more in action. So if I captured something out of my project management system that was how I document the location that I document a user acceptance test in, or a factory acceptance test, they're going to want me to go to a project and show them that in that folder, not necessarily that I grabbed a copy of it. But the more times you've been audited, they're going to build some trust with you, especially if you use the same auditor every time. They will spot check many of those items. So, Chris, you're exactly right. Be sure you're going to capture what you want to show them, but you're going to also likely on a few of those have to take them to the system and actually show it kind of a live version of it. So great question. All right, so back to the areas that provide the most value. For us, Interstates, when I was looking at this, project kickoff is absolutely, if you're not doing, in particular, most of us always do an internal kickoff with our project team, but a lot of us weren't doing, in fact, Interstates was not doing a client kickoff until we started prepping for our first audit. And I found over the years, a lot of my project managers continue to push back on whether they needed the client kickoff. It is absolutely where you're going to start talking about what are the value pieces that, that they see as value, and you're going to start validating requirements and all that type of stuff in that meeting. So it's really a hugely important part of running your project, and it happens way early in the project. So think of project kickoff as kind of getting the project started in the right direction. But we found that one to be very much a huge value proposition for us, and when we started applying it at the client level, we get a tremendous amount more value from there. So the second one, requirements validation, I think most of us would say that's really a big, important deal for us. We're going to talk a little bit more about the overall design process. We have changed this up a lot over the years in how our project managers will drive the design process, and we'll talk a little bit about how we've split that out now and some of the successes that we've seen with that. Integration testing, doing a good job of not only your internal testing, but the site acceptance test or the factory acceptance test and those types of things. And then system commissioning, everybody does system commissioning, but what I'm talking about here is how you document the plan for doing your checkout, commissioning, and startup. We actually now have, I've got two what I call startup managers that I'm using that are actually Interstates employees, and I put them on my large projects. They spend 3 to 4 months on site with the construction teams, making sure that we're ready for checkout, commissioning, and startup. And where it really saves us is in how many man hours we spend wasting time during checkout in particular, because we won't be on site if they're really not ready for us. So those are definitely some of the big areas that we saw the most value in. So what we're going to do now is we're going to actually dig into each of the sections that are part of Section 6, and we'll look at what are they looking for and what are the keys to really implementing that section. So the first one is internal kickoff. And in particular, you see it's called internal kickoff, but it specifically calls out the team and the client. So it's not just a kickoff with your team. We were, like I said before, doing more as a team than we were as with the client. And so the real goal of this is to validate all the assumptions that were made during the sales phase and document findings that support the design phase. So one of the things that you'll do, and especially in the client kickoff, is you're going to talk about all those assumptions that were potentially listed in the proposal, but they may have breezed through those. You're going to talk about those. You're going to talk about risk. You're going to talk about schedule, lots of different things that you think as a project manager are very important to make sure that this project gets off on the right foot. And you're going to want to make sure that this happens early enough in the project that you're not already starting to build deliverables. Once you've started building the deliverables, the chances that you're going to have to do rework on the project because you didn't validate these assumptions first are huge. So why is it really critical? And this is kind of the big picture stuff here. It's what gets the team started on the right page, immediately on the project. Make sure that this is the one that I like to use. The picture in my head is very likely not the picture that's in the client's head. What I think the deliverables look like and what they think the deliverables look like is different. We got to validate that we've got the picture that they're expecting. And we may have to go back to our proposal and say, well, that's not what we agreed to build. But if you don't do that early in the game, the chances you're going to get a change order for it are really slim. So if you do this early and everybody's agreeing that that is what picture I had, then you just keep building on top of that as you go. So it gives you really the ability to understand the client's expectations early, as well as them to understand yours. What are you expecting them to do to help you be successful on the project? They want the project to be successful. They know they're going to have some deliverables. What are your expectations of RFIs on the project? When you send them a RFI, how fast are you needing a response, and how are you going to make sure you get that? So those are all important. But think about it from the terms of, it's really this really big picture, 30,000-foot view of project scope. You're not drilling into a ton of detail, but you're really talking about what it's going to take to deliver the project and try to get this 30,000-foot view picture in your head and his head, or the client's head, the same. And we found that to be the biggest reason why. We actually went back and looked at what we call killer jobs, which are anything that lose more than 10% gross profit from the original estimate. And we found that one of the biggest issues that we were running into on these large killer jobs was we didn't do a great job validating the scope up front. We just jumped into the deliverables. So this is something we spend a tremendous amount of time on. I shouldn't say time, but of effort, just to make sure that it gets done well. It doesn't take that long if you do it, if you're prepared and have some templates in place to do that. So one of the things that I will encourage you to do with almost all of these sections, like for internal kickoff, build yourself a template that you're going to use for the agenda for your internal kickoff meeting and for your client kickoff meeting. So you make sure you cover all those topics that are important to cover. Otherwise, you're going to miss some things that you should cover. So requirements, that's another, how do we validate requirements? So do you review the system requirements with the client to ensure that that they're still consistent with client's expectations? Lots of times, the client built their request for proposal. They had a set of expectations in their head. We bid against those expectations. We're going to deliver to those. But when you get in that client kickoff meeting, you realize some of their expectations are changing. And it may mean that you need a change order. It may also mean that things have gotten easier for you. The picture that they had was much more complicated than it needed to be. And as you dug through the scope, you realize this could be done better, faster, easier, with more value to the client. So you talk about those. But one of the things that's really key in this is to verify that you know who all the key stakeholders are. Even just recently, we had this happen. We thought we had identified all the key stakeholders. About probably 3 weeks into a 10-week project, a new stakeholder shows up and turns the project upside down. And we didn't even know who this person was. Turns out they were the kind of the owner of this package, but it really just made a huge impact on the overall project. And we had to kind of back up and start over again. And yeah, we know this inside and out, but sometimes you gotta really dig to find out the key stakeholders. And that's one of the keys that I listed here. Make sure you identify all of the stakeholders. Set your initial requirements baseline. You're gonna talk through that with the client. You're gonna get some approval of some sort from them on, here's what we think the requirements are. You agree with those. you've already got a signed proposal document that likely has them listed, and that may be all you need, but if anything has changed from that, when you're in your kickoff meeting, make sure you get that documented and get the customer to sign off on it. If there's any impact of those changes to the cost, schedule, whatever, make sure you review that with the client and you get their agreeing to that as well. And then define what is the acceptance criteria. This is another one of those things that I think we miss a lot of times, a lot of integrators miss, is if you don't establish what is it going to take to prove to you that this project meets your needs, how are you ever going to hit the finish line? And I've had several times in projects where I finally just had to bring it out to the customer. I just have no way of knowing what the finish line looks like here, guys. What does it look like to you? And then walking through that with them. So make sure you establish, that's one of the keys, establish how you're going to prove that your project meets those acceptance criteria. Under design, this is, you know, do you do internal design reviews? Now, this is an audited item. Who do you get involved? Is it your senior individuals from just this team or from other teams? They're looking for you getting outsiders involved. All team members, make sure that the team members that are on it are involved. Do you need mock-ups? You know, oftentimes we put together an HMI mock-up for sure to get their idea on, you know, density of the HMI static screens. Is this the level of information you want to see on the screen, or is it too busy for you? Before you get all the HMI screens built and you realize, oh, this is not going to work. And we look at template electrical drawings. This is our standard package. This is how we plan to provide those. Make sure that that's an okay method for them before you get all your drawings done and you realize they want different types of schematics than we're used to building. So a couple of keys that we've learned here is we've split a lot of our design out into separate meetings. We used to do a big picture design meeting. Now most of ours are done as individuals, like we do a network design. You know, our networks are getting much, much more complicated today than they've ever been. It's going to get worse. The more of the industrial Internet of Things hitting the plant floor, as well as just, you know, a lot more virtual infrastructures and Ethernet IP devices that are connecting to the network. So you know, the network design's a big part of the process. We do that as a separate meeting. We do one for a control panel design. We do our programming design. We may do just our overall drawing design as a completely separate meeting. And this has been really successful for us because you can then just focus on having the team members in that meeting that can relate to that design instead of trying to get the whole team together and wasting some of their time. But then the other key here is make sure that the reviews are being done by individuals outside the core team. And that might mean that it's a manager level looking at the deliverables, but make sure it's someone who's not building the deliverables. On the HMI, the PLC, the drawings, you know, the network diagram, whatever, have someone look at it that's got, you know, more of a senior level experience, but they're not in the day-to-day on it. They're less likely to miss the minor details. So that's been a big win for us, is to make sure that we're getting people outside the core team involved. Under development, does the integrator have a development and assembly standards process? So this does not just mean deliverables from your programming. This also includes hardware, so your control panel assembly, how you're going to do that. And as I was talking about earlier, you know, lots of times you have to go look at other sections inside the best practices section 6, and you'll realize that it covers more than just software design or drawings and documentation. It's the actual assembly standards for the control panel as well. So make sure you've got design standards that you've developed. That's part of the building your system to get ready for an audit, but it's also part of your building your system just to get better at delivering this for your client. And then make sure that they're being modified based on lessons learned. Now, one of the things that we have found as being, you know, kind of key to this, we used to, you know, frequently we would just try to sell our client on our standards, and we really struggled using theirs. But sometimes you have no choice but to use their standards. So you got to make sure that gets to your team, whatever it is, your drawing standards, maybe they've got a different control panel design layout that they need. Whatever that is, if it's not an outdated standard and you can't really, you know, you can make some suggestions, but you're likely going to have to follow them. So make sure your team understands we're not using our standards, we're using the customer standards, and here's what they are. If you don't have standards that they want you to use, make sure they're using yours. Establish those standards at the right at the very front of the project, and make sure that they're following them. That's something you're going to have to check up on fairly frequently, early on in the project especially. And then after the project's done, perform post-job review and capture lessons learned. That's covered in a whole nother section, but it's important to remember in this section in particular, because System Development Lifecycle is still one of those things that you're going to learn something from every project. Make sure you're getting that passed around to the rest of the team members. So factory acceptance testing, this is one that we just call it user acceptance testing. So we bring in the operators into our, typically we force them to bring their operators to our facility in our simulation and environment. And so we can get them away from their systems and their day-to-day operations. Otherwise, they never stay in the room with us. They're always getting called out for something. But do you have a formal verification process that ensures that you met the requirements of the project? So number one, way back when we talked about validating requirements, you've got to make sure that you've got a way to verify that those requirements were met. If you don't build a test plan to do this, the chances that you're going to validate all those requirements is really slim. So build a formal test plan, make sure that they're following this process, and you know, every project uses it. And from that formal test plan, you need to make sure that you get it sent to the client and approved before you start testing. Because if you send it to them and they don't think that it proves that you're validating the right functionality, you could do a great job of testing it yourself in integration testing. You pull into factory acceptance test or user acceptance test, and they don't like it at all. And now you're scrambling in the middle of your test to figure out, how am I going to prove that we're going to meet all the requirements? So our deal is build a formal test plan, make sure that it validates all the functionality that we need to validate, and then you know, verify how it fits into this. So the other best practice that we like to use is use team members that are not part of your development team to do the integration testing. A lot of times we use our support team. We have a formal dedicated support team that takes our calls once we're in warranty period, and then after the project is done. Those guys have seen about everything, and we have them do a lot of our initial integration testing so that we can prove to ourselves that we're ready for user acceptance or factory acceptance test. So one of the things I just wanted to show you again, though, is when we looked at this early, you can see requirements are on this side of the screen and our design and unit testing. But what we have to be able to do is show this traceability all the way over to site acceptance and factory acceptance test. How do we prove that these requirements are being met with these tests? And that's really what that model that was being shown in the Best Practices Manual is all about. So then installation. Installation is in section 6. It doesn't currently have any audited points associated with that, but I just pulled out a couple of keys for that. You know, if you look at, this is the section, this is what it says. Make sure you've got standards in place for installation, that you have coordination methods with your subcontractors, and you may not have a subcontractor, but likely you're working with other contractors on site to get it installed, or to, you know, and in particular, your electrical connections are going to be working. You may not have them subbed under you, but they're still one of the subcontractors on the site that you're going to have to depend on to do it well. And then establish early who's responsible for what. So the client's going to do this, the subcontractors are going to do that, the integrator is going to do this. So that's part of your kind of pre-startup plan. And when you get into the last phase of this, which is implementation, you need to have some good plans in place. But the keys here, this really falls back to the PM to plan and coordinate well. Start talking to the client early and make sure that, you know, they know what's got to be done. And oftentimes we find that the client will take some of that burden on. They're not our subcontractors in a lot of places, but we need to tell the client, this is what we need from your subcontractor. And can I talk directly to them? And that's a huge thing for the project manager. If you have to always go through a general contractor to get to a sub, or go through the client to get to the sub, the chances you're going to get all the information you need are a lot slimmer. So if subs are involved, make sure you know what is the line of demarc, who do I have to go through to get to the sub, and then try to get that line changed if you can, so that you can get direct access to them. For commissioning, obviously another huge part of what we do, but again, no currently audited points. This is really about, you know, checkout, commissioning, and startup, verifying you got all your I/O connections correct, you're running your sequences and testing interlocks and making product. All of us use a little different, potentially a little different terminology and definition. We may all say checkout, but the way we do it may be a tad bit different. But what the real key here is, walk through that with the client. However you're planning to do it, talk to them early about how you plan to run checkout, commissioning, and startup, and get them started thinking about it, because you need to determine how are you going to prove to them that it's making product. Oftentimes, our company very seldom has a making product at rate criteria in our proposal. Most of the time it's building the plant to make this product, but the at rate it really revolves around the technology provider. So if, for instance, in the ethanol industry, if they're not able to get the water out of the alcohol and get 100 proof alcohol, that whole process of doing that is really a vendor that supplied that process. So we built the code, but we got the narrative from them. So we did it based on their narrative. So you just need to establish, what does it mean to be fully functioning? And if it is making product at rate, what are you expecting to prove? How are we going to prove that? If you don't have enough ingredients in-house to run for a certain length of time, it's pretty important to know that because if you're not going to be able to produce product at rate for 2 hours because they didn't have enough ingredients, that's not my problem, that's the customer's problem. But you need to know that that's what they're expecting so you can ask the right questions early. Does your contract state production rates? If it does, you're going to have to hit those production rates. If it doesn't, you need to establish what's my finish line look like. So that's kind of the big piece that we get out of here, is just really establishing what are we going to look for to say that commissioning is done, and in particular, site acceptance is done. Now, we oftentimes don't use the terminology site acceptance test, but I will tell you that when you're being audited on this, they're going to expect some form of a document that proves whatever you said was the acceptance criteria were met, and that the customer signs off on that the acceptance criteria was met, and that your punch list is complete and you've moved on to the next, into the warranty period. They're going to want some type of a proof document there. So, but a couple of things that go along with that, and they're in the bullets here. Do you have a site-specific site acceptance test plan? Do you have a method put together to actually track punch list items that are being recorded, and who's recording them, and whose responsibility is it to record them? Do you have an issues list, and how do you plan to review that and get those signed off on? Issues are typically different than punch list items. They may be punch lists, but they may be slightly different than that. And then ensure that, any changes are reflected back in the final documentation package. So we make changes. We had to move a point in the PLC panel. How do we know that drawing got updated? So having processes to prove that, and that becomes part of your final acceptance package. And then obtaining signatures for your acceptance. So I don't know if any of you have got the same problem that we have. We frequently find it difficult to get signatures on things like, this test plan proves that it's going to meet your acceptance criteria. This, we finished the startup and we've completed our punch list. Here, sign this document that says we're done. We have to sometimes, really force them to get it done, and it may mean, sometimes you just got to really work hard at it. But if you talk early about this with the client, and that's one of the keys, have your forms already pre-developed and start talking about it at your kickoff meeting. What are we expecting them to sign at the end of the project, and get their agreements to it early in the project, and then every time you meet with that client, remind them about, we're getting closer to a factory acceptance test. We're going to have this document we're going to need you to sign off on. Just wanted to remind you of that. And then the bigger picture for, like, if you're going to get audited, make sure you store these documents in the same place on all projects. Auditors will ask you to produce these completed forms. You may show them, just like Chris was asking earlier, you may show them a completed document that you've stored in a folder. But what they're going to ask you to do is, well, can you pick a project that you're currently working on now and show me your user acceptance test plan that you're planning to use on this? It looks like, give me one that you're 70, 80% complete on, that you're going to be moving into startup. Do you have your test plan put together? Do you have a sign-off on the requirements document, and show that to me? So they're going to ask you to produce some of those. They may ask you for one project to produce one document and a totally different project to produce a different document. But if you can't find them, which that was a big problem for us in our first couple of audits for sure, the PMs weren't always storing them in the right locations and or the technical resources, so it got to be a problem. So make sure that you do that. And then really the big picture, if you think about what did we learn from implementing this, those were all the sections in Section 6. big picture, and this really applies to all sections and best practices when you're trying to build the processes. Get your team leads involved in helping you build it. If you don't, you won't get the implementation the way you want it. They won't buy into it near as well as if they're involved in helping build it. So that's a key one for any of the sections, but in particular I list it for Section 6 because it's a must-pass section. Make sure that you've established locations for your deliverables and verify that they're being stored there. We use a SharePoint site that we store this information on, and that works very well. Communicate early and often with your client to describe things like how you're going to test, how you're going to verify the system meets their criteria. Make sure they know they will need to sign off. If they are one of those customers that does not like to sign off, you need to be talking to them early and often about, here's the document I'm going to deliver to you, and and I'm expecting a signature on this. Who do I need to be talking to get the signature? And so as a PM, that's one of our roles, is to start that early and make sure we're doing it often. And then when you're building your test plan, make sure that all those requirements you validated way up front are addressed in some fashion in the test plan. How am I going to prove that you met them? So just a huge thing in our standpoint, oftentimes our test plans proved that the system worked, but they never really tied back to what were the real functions that the customer said the system had to do. So we've modified our test plans considerably over the years to make sure that they address those requirements a lot better today. So that kind of covers the material I wanted to cover with you on Section 6 today, and hopefully you've been able to get some guidance as to how to best apply this. But I will open it up. If you've got any questions, you can type those in the Q&A box, or Monica will also open up the microphones, and you're more than welcome to actually ask a question verbally as well. So Monica, I'll let you go ahead and open up the mics. Any questions associated with implementing Section 6 or just System Development Lifecycle in general? Okay, I don't see any on the Q&A box at the moment.
And I have unmute those who have called in, so if you want to ask a question over the phone, we should be able to hear it.
All right, well, it looks like some are starting to drop off, and I just wanted to make sure I really appreciate you joining today, and hopefully I've been able to give you something of value that you can use in your operation. Again, this is one of those must-pass sections, and more importantly, this is one of those sections that if you do well at this, you will guaranteed make more money on projects. You will lose less money. I will put it that way. You'll lose less money on projects. Hey, Jose, do you have anything in wrap-up that you wanted to cover?
Yes, thank you very much. I'll provide the closing. To all the attendees, thank you for your participation. My hope is that you have several takeaways. Jeff, thank you very much for the contribution of your time and expertise. Your presentation was very insightful. We wish the best to you and to Interstate. Keep up the good work, and we look forward to having you for another webinar of this series. Thanks again to our host and sponsor, John Weber and Monica Anderson of Software Toolbox. To everybody, please be sure to complete the survey for today's webinar. It will be directly to you automatically at the end of this webinar, and it only takes 30 seconds to complete 44 questions. Your feedback is necessary for our continuous improvement for the presenter and for CSIA. So in closing, here are two important considerations. Project lifecycle management can have a dramatic impact on the performance of your projects, and the system integrators play a crucial role in end-user systems. So make sure that you're applying the best practices when you're delivering your projects. Kindly, if you have a suggested topic for a webinar, include it in your survey comments. This is Jose Rivera, CSIA CEO. Thanks again for attending, and goodbye.